Prologue: Echoes of Empire. The crisp canvas of a late 17th century maritime painting captures a scene that, to the casual observer, might merely depict a merchant vessel departing English shores. Yet within its meticulous brushstrokes, the billowing sails, the distant coastline fading into the mist, the proud ensign of St. George snapping at the masthead, lies a profound historical narrative. This ship, an instrument of trade and exploration, is also a harbinger of dominion, carrying not only goods, but also the ambitions, laws, and cultural imprints of a nascent global power. It represents the quiet, yet inexorable outward thrust of a nation poised to redefine its identity, and, in doing so, reshape the very contours of the world. The echoes of that initial expansion, centuries later, still reverberate, manifesting in the geopolitical structures, economic interdependencies, and complex cultural identities that define our contemporary era. A world remade, the enduring impact of British imperialism. To truly grasp the intricate tapestry of the modern world, its often unequal distribution of wealth and power, its diverse linguistic and legal frameworks, its enduring social stratification, and the very fault lines of international relations, one must undertake an unflinching examination of the British imperial project. For over 3 centuries, the British Crown, operating through an evolving panoply of chartered companies, military might, administrative bureaucracies, and shifting political philosophies, extended its suzerainty over an astonishingly vast dominion. At its zenith, the empire encompassed approximately a quarter of the Earth's landmass and governed nearly a fifth of its population. This colossal undertaking was never a singular, monolithic entity. Rather, it was a dynamic, often contradictory, and perpetually adapting enterprise. It was a period marked by unprecedented resource extraction, forced migrations that irrevocably altered demographics, the coercive imposition of legal and educational systems, and the complex interplay of cultural exchange, sometimes mutual, but more often profoundly asymmetrical. From the sprawling sugar plantations of the West Indies, fueled by the agonizing labor of enslaved Africans, to the fertile jute fields of Bengal, harvested for metropolitan textile mills, from the diamond and gold mines that carved scars across the South African veld, to the burgeoning free ports of Hong Kong and Singapore that became linchpins of global trade, the Crown's pervasive presence acted as a seismic force. It irrevocably transformed indigenous societies, restructured economies, and fundamentally altered the identities of countless millions. This book endeavors to unpack this monumental endeavor, moving beyond simplistic hagiographies or condemnations to explore the intricate, often brutal, and always human web of power, profit, resistance, and adaptation that characterized the relationship between the British monarchy and its manifold colonies. The unfolding narrative, purpose, and scope of this book. This volume, The Crown and the Colonies, aims to provide a comprehensive and critical illumination of the definitions, evolutionary trajectories, administrative machinery, and enduring consequences of this profound imperial dynamic. Our journey will traverse the centuries, commencing with the nascent ventures of the 17th century and tracing the gradual solidification of British expansion from speculative enterprises to sophisticated, institutionalized control. We will chart its zenith in the Victorian era, its gradual decline following 2 devastating World War IIs, and its ultimate dissolution through widespread decolonization movements of the mid-20th century. Crucially, the narrative will extend beyond formal independence, exploring the profound and often unresolved reverberations that continue to shape post-colonial nations and inform contemporary international discourse. Within this overarching framework, we will meticulously examine the shifting legal frameworks that defined colonial status, the intricate administrative machinery that governed diverse populations, the relentless economic drivers that fueled expansion and exploitation, and the significant social and cultural transformations wrought by Crown rule. A particular emphasis will be placed on the distinctive characteristics and operational realities of Crown colonies, those territories that were brought under the direct administrative purview of the monarch, often through appointed officials and with limited local autonomy. This focus allows for a deeper understanding of the mechanisms of direct imperial control, contrasting it with other forms of colonial governance. Our narrative will highlight key examples from across the global sweep of the British Empire, offering both broad historical strokes that illustrate overarching imperial policy and granular insights into specific regions. Special attention will be paid to the Indian subcontinent, particularly the Bengal Presidency, which encompassed the territory of modern Bangladesh, serving as a powerful case study for the profound and often fraught interactions between the Crown and its colonial subjects. Through this detailed exploration, we aim to foster a nuanced and critical understanding of an imperial project that, while sometimes lauded for its contributions to infrastructure, legal systems, and administrative efficiency, was equally a source of immense exploitation, widespread famine, violent conflict, and a complex, often contested heritage that continues to shape the contemporary world. Part 1. Forging the Imperial Will, 17th to mid-19th century. Chapter 1. Genesis of Dominion, the birth of British overseas expansion. The very concept of a global British Empire was not born fully formed, but emerged through a complex interplay of economic ambition, strategic necessity, and shifting geopolitical landscapes. For England, the late 16th and early 20th centuries represented a pivotal moment, transitioning from a regional maritime power, often preoccupied with European dynastic struggles, to an aspiring global player. The early ventures across the Atlantic and into the Indian Ocean were not dictated by a singular, cohesive imperial grand strategy, but rather by a diverse and often competing cocktail of private enterprise, religious zeal, scientific curiosity, and the tantalizing promise of untold wealth. Early ventures, from privateers to plantations. The Elizabethan era, romanticized for the daring exploits of sea dogs like Sir Francis Drake and Sir Walter Raleigh, was more than just a period of state-sanctioned piracy against Spanish treasure fleets. These figures, while celebrated for their buccaneering, also engaged in the nascent attempts at establishing permanent overseas settlements. The ill-fated Roanoke colony in the 1580s, despite its enigmatic disappearance, underscored a burgeoning, if as yet unfulfilled, desire for a stable foothold in the New World. However, it was the opening decades of the 17th century that witnessed the more sustained and ultimately successful efforts towards colonization, driven largely by powerful chartered companies and, notably, by religious dissenters seeking freedom from persecution. The establishment of Jamestown in 1607 by the Virginia Company of London represented a foundational, albeit excruciatingly challenging, milestone. These early settlements were characterized by immense fragility, constantly threatened by disease, famine, and often violent encounters with indigenous populations. Yet they persevered, fueled by the relentless prospect of economic gain, primarily through the cultivation of tobacco, which rapidly became a highly lucrative cash crop for the European market. Simultaneously, British interests began to expand into the Caribbean archipelago. Islands like Barbados and Jamaica, initially contested, rapidly developed into highly profitable sugar plantations. These ventures, however, were predicated upon a brutal and morally reprehensible system of enslaved labor, primarily drawn from West Africa, which would indelibly stain the imperial project for centuries. The demand for these tropical commodities would become a crucial economic engine for the nascent empire, inextricably linking European consumption to colonial exploitation and human suffering. The lure of the New World: resources, markets, and prestige. The allure of establishing overseas colonies was undeniably multifaceted, appealing to various segments of English society and the Crown itself. Economically, the New World promised vast, untapped natural resources, dense forests for naval timber, rich fur-bearing animal populations for the boom in European fashion industry, and later, agricultural staples like tobacco, cotton, and sugar, which could not be grown in Britain's temperate climate. Colonies were also envisioned as captive new markets for English manufactured goods, forming a self-sustaining economic bloc under the prevailing mercantilist theories of the age, which sought to maximize exports and minimize imports to accumulate national wealth. Beyond direct material gain, colonies offered profound strategic advantages and the relentless geopolitical rivalries with established European powers such as Spain, France, and the Netherlands. They provided potential naval bases, coaling stations in later centuries, and forward outposts for projecting national power and protecting trade routes. For a significant segment of the population, particularly religious dissenters, the New World represented more than just economic opportunity. It was an escape from religious persecution and societal constraints, an unprecedented chance to build new societies based on their own theological or social ideals. This potent amalgam of economic imperative, strategic foresight, and ideological motivation provided the sustained impetus for a long, often brutal, and perpetually evolving phase of colonial expansion. Company rule: the Virginia Company and the East India Company. Ironically, much of England's initial and most impactful overseas expansion was facilitated not by direct state control, but by the emergence of powerful, privately run chartered companies. These entities, granted significant monopolies and quasi-sovereign powers by the Crown, effectively functioning as an extension of English authority, albeit with a primary motive of profit. The Virginia Company, for instance, held vast tracts of land and jurisdictional authority over its North American territories, responsible for everything from governance and defense to trade and resource exploitation. Its charter allowed it to raise capital, recruit settlers, and establish laws, operating almost as a state within a state in the distant colonies. Even more profoundly impactful was the East India Company, established in 1600. Initially conceived as a trading venture in spices, textiles, and other lucrative Asian commodities, the company gradually transcended its commercial origins. Through a combination of strategic alliances, military intervention, and shrewd political maneuvering, it began to acquire territorial control and administrative functions across the Indian subcontinent. It raised its own armies, minted its own currency, and administered vast populations, effectively laying the groundwork for what would become one of the largest and most dominant imperial forces in history. These companies often operated with immense autonomy, shaping colonial policy and local realities in profound ways, frequently clashing with both indigenous powers and, at times, with the distant authority of the Crown itself. The first royal interventions. Virginia's transformation, 1624. The relationship between the Crown and these powerful chartered companies was inherently fraught and often characterized by tension. Mismanagement, endemic financial instability, and chronic internal conflicts within the nascent colonies frequently led to appeals for or impositions of royal intervention. The case of the Virginia Company provides a seminal example of this dynamic and marks a crucial turning point in the evolution of British colonial governance. Following years of persistent financial struggles, incredibly high mortality rates among settlers, and escalating conflicts with indigenous populations, ultimately culminating dramatically in the Great Massacre of 1622, King James I grew increasingly concerned with the company's ability to effectively govern. Its perceived failures threatened not only royal prestige, but also the long-term viability of the English presence in North America. In 1624, citing gross mismanagement, financial insolvency, and the colony's demonstrable inability to provide for its own defense and welfare, King James formally revoked the Virginia Company's charter. In its stead, Virginia was officially declared a royal colony, or more commonly, a crown colony. This transformation meant that the territory would now be directly administered by the monarch through an appointed governor and an advisory council, both answerable to London. This pivotal event set a critical precedent, clearly signaling the Crown's readiness, indeed its ultimate prerogative, to assert direct control over its overseas possessions when private enterprise faltered or when overriding strategic and national interests demanded it. It ushered in an era where the Crown's direct influence would steadily grow, gradually superseding the often chaotic and self-serving nature of early company rule. Defining control, understanding Crown, proprietary, and self-governing colonies. The heterogeneous origins of British colonial expansion, encompassing private ventures, religious migrations, and state-sanctioned conquests, necessarily led to a varied administrative landscape across the nascent empire. This complex mosaic of governance can be broadly categorized into three principal types, each representing a different degree of direct royal control. Crown or royal colonies. These territories were directly governed by the British monarch, with all authority flowing from London. The governor, appointed by the Crown, often on the advice of the Privy Council or later the Colonial Office, served as the chief executive and held significant legislative and judicial powers. While some Crown colonies might have had local assemblies, their powers were typically limited, and the governor retained a royal veto. Virginia, after 1624, became the foundational archetype of this model, characterized by centralized control, a strong emphasis on imperial directives, and the explicit prioritization of metropolitan economic and strategic interests. Proprietary colonies were these vast tracts of land granted by the Crown to individuals or groups of proprietors, who then held extensive administrative, legislative, and land rights, all while operating under a royal charter that defined the scope and limitations of their powers. Notable examples include Maryland, founded by Lord Baltimore, and Pennsylvania, established by William Penn. While enjoying significant autonomy, the proprietors were ultimately vassals of the Crown, and their charters could be, and sometimes were, revoked. Self-governing, or charter colonies. These colonies were distinguished by possessing charters that granted substantial legislative powers to elected assemblies, thereby allowing for a considerable degree of local self-rule. Early Massachusetts Bay, with its potent Puritan influence, and a populace that actively elected its own governors and representatives, exemplifies this type. These colonies often developed robust local political traditions and institutions, fostering a sense of autonomy that frequently brought them into conflict with imperial directives. While still acknowledging the ultimate sovereignty of the Crown, their internal governance was largely managed by their own citizenry. As the British Empire expanded and its administrative structures became more sophisticated and centralized, the trend would increasingly lean towards direct Crown rule. The conversion of proprietary and even some self-governing colonies into Crown colonies became a recurring theme throughout the 18th century, particularly as the Crown sought to exert firmer authority, rationalize administration, and ensure a more efficient flow of resources from its growing global network. This shift underscored a fundamental evolution in imperial thought, moving from a more laissez-faire approach towards a more centralized and interventionist model of control.